Next up, we will have a video presentation by Dr. George Beck, retired CSU professor in biosciences. He was a weed science professor and did many years of service for the state of Colorado and pasture range and non-crop noxious weed management. And he will specifically talk about noxious weeds in the Front Range. And he was a co-author with the many others of the western states in the book Weed Control in Natural Areas in the Western United States. And with that, we will switch over to his video presentation.
I'm going to talk in the next hour about some common B-list noxious weeds along the Front Range in Colorado and how to control them. But first, I'd like to get some principles, fundamental principles up and forward, because I'm going to talk about primarily using herbicides to create the opportunity from a land management perspective to deal with the problems. Weeds respond positively to disturbance. They're opportunistic plants, ruderal plants ecologically, and they have a dozen to up to 20 or so biological characteristics that they share that we have noticed over time as human beings. And so the issue of what happens during a disturbance is quite varied. It can be subtle, it can be dramatic, but the big one from a weed management perspective is that when plants die, they leach out their nutrients into the soil, but especially nitrate nitrogen seems to be a driver of opportunity for these plants, and weeds respond positively to increase nitrate nitrogen in the soil. So that's kind of a nutshell approach to what happens and why weeds do what they do. Secondary succession is an outcome of weeds and disturbance. There have to be available sites, and the disturbance provides that, so the plants have a place to live regardless of whether they're a weed or a desirable one. And the species that are available at that site can be controlled by the land manager to no small degrees. Sometimes all the propagules are present with them seeds or vegetative propagules, but you also may have to introduce seeds of the desirable plant community if necessary. And this is kind of as you go management. The available species, whether you influence that or just living with what's out there, performs differently as climatic conditions in particular change. And of course, in our state, soil moisture is the biggest driver of that event. So one thing that all weed management has in common is competition from desirable species is the keystone for successful weed management. Without it, you're just fighting yourself. Bare ground is about the only place where you're not worried about competition. You actually want to eliminate that. But using herbicide, for example, to control weeds either kills or suppresses those plants, and the weed growth there then is below some threshold of impact. The weeds use fewer resources, which then become available for the desirable members of the plant community to use as they occupy the sites. These are the tenets of IPM, or successional weed management. So with that in mind, I'll spring forward and get right into my presentation on weed control. I'm going to start off with diffused and spotted knapweed, some old foes we have along the Front Range here. We've had diffused knapweed for a long time. Spotted's catching up, unfortunately. So Centaurea diffusus, a member of the sunflower family, it's a semiparous perennial, a term I think somebody made up because you can't find it in a dictionary, but it means it lives for an unspecified period of time. So the majority of the plants behave as perennials, sometimes they're annual or even biennial, but they spread only from seed. And as most of you folks are familiar with, the shoots break off and tumble with the wind, which is an outstanding mechanism to move seed across the landscape. It's a huge problem along the Front Range. We have a very wonderful habitat for it. All the knapweeds evolved with the receding glaciers in Europe and Asia. And boy, you look at the Great Plains, and that's exactly what happened here too. So they're right at home. Now here's a map. I chose to use the ED maps because we don't really have any decent state maps, and the ones I have are not up to date. So the ED maps is a really good program. I think Colorado's participating in it. But you can see diffuse knapweed is a huge problem throughout the western U.S., and we have almost all of our counties have some degree of diffuse knapweed. Centaurea stovia is spotted knapweed, and it's a perennial, can live up to about 9 years old or so. It produces upwards of 40,000 seeds per square meter during moist years. It tends to occupy more mesic regions of the U.S. and plus in its home countries. The seeds germinate in spring or fall. Unlike diffuse knapweed, which has typically just one shoot, unless it gets broken off, then it might have two. Spotted knapweed may produce half a dozen shoots or more. If you look at the photograph on the bottom right, it's an old spotted knapweed rosette, and you can see all the previous year's shoots. So it can be a pretty robust plant. It's native to Central Europe and east to Central Russia, the Caucasian region, which is very similar to Colorado, and Western Siberia. And in those locations, it's most aggressive on this forest grassland interface. In fact, that's where it seems to be the biggest problem for us here in North America, possibly with the Southwest Colorado being an exception to that. So it's expanding its range, if you will. So an ed map of spotted knapweed is very well distributed in the West. And you can see mostly in the northern tier of states. I have a good friend that used to teach at the University of Minnesota, and I'd go up, he used to be the director of Itasca, which is an experiment station way up north, and they were just starting to get knapweed up there. And of course, those are all glaciated soils, and it just went nuts. In just a few years, the place was covered. And of course, they twiddled their thumbs trying to figure out what to do. And before they know it, everywhere they looked, they had spotted knapweed. So it's a formidable plant to deal with. A young spotted knapweed rosette, of course, this is a good size to target. Unfortunately, it's small enough that it goes unseen. These older plants are typically more of what we're looking at as far as herbicide use and even biological control from that standpoint. But they grow similarly, that is diffuse and spotted knapweed. But you can tell the two apart pretty easily once it gets to the flowering growth stage. The diffuse knapweed on the left, this specimen has a white flower, but it can also have the lavender flowers as well. But the way you tell the two species and all the thistles and knapweeds apart is by their bracts. And as you can see on diffuse knapweed, the central bract has got a sharp spine on it, and it's uncomfortable to handle that. And you can see fringe on the side of the bract, kind of like teeth on a comb. Somewhat similar on spotted knapweed. It has a black tip though, and it doesn't really have that long reflexing central spine. So they're fairly easy to tell apart. Otherwise, they have roughly the same size head, and the flower color can be the same or different. Now, as far as managing with herbicides, aminopyrrolate is one of the best. Our new product is Whetstone, and it's 7 fluid ounces per acre. The optimum timing is bolting through the fall. So we have an extended period of time in which you can use the product. Now, I would avoid the month of July in our state. It's usually hot and dry. The Palmer Divide is kind of an exception to that. Oftentimes they can have showers every day, so you have a little bit more latitude with regard to timing. Picloram or Triumph 22K is still one of the standards at a pint per acre from rosettes, either in the spring or fall. That works exceptionally well. Those two have lots of soil activity, so you have residual in the soil to catch germinating seedlings that might occur after treatment. Now, clopyrrolate, our product being Sonora, you apply it 2/3 to 1 pint per acre, and again, targeting the rosettes in spring or fall. It doesn't have a lot of displayed soil activity for spotted or diffuse knapweed, and I say displayed because it seems to be species oriented. And this is one of the things that came out of Joe DiTomaso's book in California. Was the learning lesson. I'm old enough, I can get away with this. I learned a herbicide either had soil activity or it didn't. It didn't depend so much on plant species, much less location. At any rate, we have this common cast of characters you'll see again for almost all the thistles and knapweed. My next weed to talk about is Russian knapweed. It's one of my personal favorites. It's a huge problem in our state, all over the Intermountain West, but even on the Great Plains. It's hard pressed to make much progress on the Great Plains because it's so dry. But we have a significant amount of the problem here in Colorado. It's another member of the sunflower family. It's a creeping herbaceous perennial. and it reproduces then from both the roots and the seed stock. Seed, it produces a lot of seed. Not always is it viable, and it's only viable in soil for 2 or 3 years. So the primary mechanism of spread is through the rhizomes and such. Now, there's a brown to black scaly appearance on the crowns and the roots, the roots you're not going to be able to see at 75 miles an hour going down the interstate. But this is available to you as a land manager to examine 12 months out of the year. So it's pretty easy to tell, say, from Canada thistle, even during the winter months. Russian knapweed is allelopathic, and it may form monocultures. We see this. The monocultures are most expressed in heavy clay soils. It is toxic to horses. It and yellow star thistle were the plants that were sampled. I actually had a grad student buddy that ran an experiment, and it produces what we call as a chewing disease. It's very sad to see. The 25-cent term is nigropalatal encephalomalacia. I'm surprised I can say that without tripping over my tongue, but it's fatal to the horse. And they literally starve to death or die of dehydration over a period of 6 weeks, and there's no recovery from it to my knowledge. It gets the landowners going, though. I mean, I used to use this. Maybe I'm a little evil there, but the pencils that start moving when they found out about a plant that's as toxic to their beloved animals as Russian knapweed. Typically, they won't eat it, thankfully, because it tastes terrible. Very widespread through the western United States, then a few places in the east, but it tends to like the drier climates. Now, this is key. This is a slide from 1 year. We did a study for about 5 years when I was at CSU. The two lines to pay attention here are the blue line, which is soil temperature, and the red line, which is the number of root buds that we found on about 10 centimeter long section of crown and roots. And we would go out once a week. Again, we did this for 5 years. Of course, I said my students, everyone knows professors don't work anyway. But what you can see in this particular year, we had a peak of root bud activity, their growth that is, in the month of January. So this is why we think the winter treatments, fall treatments work so well, is because the root system is metabolically very active and becomes a strong sink then for herbicides. And that's an hypothesis, but it seems to bear fruit with regard to our experience managing it. So this, you can see the black to brown scaly appearance on the crown just below my fingers there in a little white root bud. This is dug up in December. So this plant hadn't quite has gone as crazy as some of the other specimens that we had. And then a few months later in March, those root buds start to grow as the soil warms up a bit. One of them surfaces and the other ones typically slough off. You'll only get one of them that survives. And the root system and the crowns are pretty much vacant of their ability to reproduce vegetatively from that point until that cycle starts again in late August, in the late summer and the fall of the year. Now, just as soon as it starts to emerge, it almost bolts instantly. It's a little like Canada thistle from that standpoint. This is not a good growth stage to use herbicides to control Russian knapweed. Typically, you don't see activity on that patch until the following fall when that root bud cycle starts again. It's very interesting. We saw this in a couple of our experiments. But nonetheless, shortly thereafter, when all of these root buds are up and growing as shoots, is when you want to start the spraying cycle. Russian knapweed flowers are pretty distinct. They're much different, of course, than the diffused and spotted knapweed. They're a little bit larger, often have or typically have this lavender type color, but they can also have a white flower. And the bracts are very smooth, papery thin, and that's one way you can tell them apart. Now, as far as control, whetstone works exceptionally well at 5 to 7 fluid ounces per acre. We always found it here in Colorado work best with the fall application, again, owing to that root bud cycle that I shared with you. The Russian knapweed appears dead and dormant, and how does it work? Well, it's taking it up through the root system. There's also a timing that people have found that the bud to flower in the summertime works as well. And again, the July is not a good time for applying any herbicide, particularly if it's droughty. So that's why we started looking at the fall application timing. Triumph 22K or picloram is still one of the standards, a quart per acre almost any time during the growing season. Not when it first emerges, though. It doesn't work well then. But again, late fall is when we had the greatest success. Now, you can spot spray that picloram at 2 quarts per acre, but typically you're dealing with a much larger problem. Triumph 22K plus 2,4-D is another good one that expands the spectrum of activity with a little 2,4-D. But again, the fall is the best timing application. Now, chlorpyrrolid, our product being Sonora, also works very, very well on Russian knapweed. The fall, now this is the one that's confusing because you got plants that look like the photograph on the right. Is how is that taking up foliarly? Well, I don't have an answer for that one, to be perfectly honest, but it's rapidly growing in the spring, say, into the end of May, 1st of June, it works well also, but the fall is still seemingly the best, but that's a puzzle. Now, chlorsulfuron has a lot of soil activity, so it makes more sense, and it only works well in the fall. So particularly along the Front Range, you're looking sometime in October or November, even into early December, obviously not when the soil is frozen, for your best application timing. And it takes 1 ounce of chlorsulfuron to work well. Canada thistle is the next weed of interest, and at this growth stage right now, all you weed supervisors know that this is the problem because the telephone starts ringing and my neighbor is letting all of his Canada thistle go to seed and it's getting into my yard, blah, 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 blah. It's a good vehicle for getting group participation. All right, Cercio marvens is another creeping herbaceous perennial reproducing both from seeds and roots. Produces about 1,200 seed per flowering shoot, viable in the soil around 20 years or so. So every time you let it go to seed, you give some bad luck for the next couple of decades. We know that plants are produced in very small root pieces, as evidenced by if you try to plow this stuff to kill it, you just spread it all over the field. Makes for a very nice research site, but it's very hard to raise a crop under those circumstances, even hay. The photograph of the rosettes when they're first coming up in the spring, the plants start to bolt almost immediately because the 14 hours of day length triggers the flowering cycle, which is just about the time when it first comes up in late March or early April, depending on the year and the amount of soil moisture we have available. And then very shortly thereafter, the bolting process starts and we get into the flowering growth stage. And one thing nice about Canada thistle, if there is anything nice at all, is it's easy to detect zipping down the road doing your weed surveys because it'll have multiple flower heads where most of our native thistles just have one flower head. And so you can distinguish that very quickly. Most of us are familiar with this particular plant. The flower color can be that lavender. There's even apparently some blue biotypes out there. I've never seen them, but very often too, it can be white. And you can have a mixture. Now, there's probably 2 different clones mixed together in a particular stand, but it's quite a handsome plant for some people until they go up and try to touch it and love it because it bites pretty hard because of the spines. And again, this is the Canada thistle Ono or Agee's growth stage, depending on what part of the country you're from. And true enough, you get a lot of seed that's scattered with the pappus, but the data show that most of the seed falls around the parent shoot. So that's the good news, but the bad news, it's a very successful plant. So this mechanism of spread is quite significant. Now, Dr. Phil Wester, he's the one that really ran these experiments, had his students dig up 24 of these ramets. You can see this is a shoot coming off of the root system. So this is an adventitious shoot, just about ready to burst through the soil in the early parts of the spring. Typically sometime mid-March to the first parts of April. We put those in a big box, artificial to be sure, a little warmer soil temperature. We watered them, we sung kumbaya to them. And then after 14 months, we pulled that chain off and the front boards and washed the soil off. And most of you have seen this, but it's worth the journey again. So are you ready for this? Look at that root system. Phil said they had over 3,000 feet of roots that grew over a period of 14 months out of 24 of those ramets. That's spectacular at a minimum. So this is why this plant is so difficult to control. It's just the bear cat. It occupies all of the soil. it can be just a hog. Fortunately, it doesn't occupy dry soils as well as moist soils, or we'd have a bigger problem in Colorado than we have. Because this is a thistle, you got the same group of herbicides, the auxins, that work very well. Aminopyrrolid and whetstone at 5 to 7 fluid ounces per acre works very well. You see a rate range like this, I try to stress that always start at the higher range. It just works better, and we don't see much resistance in perennial weeds. But when you apply a too low a rate, you're actually selecting for resistance as well. But again, a perennial is not as serious an issue as annuals. The best timing to spring at flowering are again fall. Now, fall is earlier than you would say with Russian knapweed. Treat would in fall earlier than Russian knapweed would be treated. But nonetheless, fall is a really good time for Canada thistle as well. You can use whetstone in riparian areas. So when the soil is moist, it really loves those sites. Whereas something like Triumph 22K or Pickram, you can't use it there. So the aminopyrrolid molecule lends itself to a broader area where the problem exists. Triumph at 1 quart per acre works exceptionally well almost any time once it starts to emerge. And because both those herbicides have such a great amount of soil activity, they continue to work on seedlings that germinate after the ramets come up. Dicamba 4 or dicamba, we always found that 2 quarts per acre in the fall provided for the most consistent control. And a year after treatment, this is somewhere between 70 and 80% control on the average. The dicamba plus 2,4-D, I don't think works as well as dicamba alone because you don't have enough dicamba when you mix the two together. Now, Sonora or clopyrrolid works exceptionally well on Canada thistle. It's a very selective molecule, so you can clean up the Canada thistle and have a burst of all kinds of stuff come through there, including forbs. 1 pint per acre in the fall is excellent, or 2/3 to 1 pint in the spring. You just got to make sure all the ramets are up because of its lack of apparent soil activity on Canada thistle. Again, that varies a little bit. Now, this is one of my favorite plants of all time, Scotch Thistle, and it just, it evolved in northern Great Britain, northern United Kingdom. And as you can see in the back there, it looks like there's this huge stand of Scotch Thistle growing in a line, and it actually is. That's an irrigation canal, and I'll address that in just a moment, but this is a pretty big plant here. It's almost 10 feet tall. We have 2 Onoportum species in Colorado, but only Onoportum acanthium is important to us, although both of them are noxious. It is the predominant species. It has pubescent or hairy leaves and hairy stems on both sides of the leaves. The Onoportum taricum or Tarian thistle is glabrous. It has no hairs on the tops of the leaves, but it's very hairy on the underneath side. They're both biennials and then reproduce only from seed. We have data on the Scotch thistle knowing that it produces about 30,000 seeds per plant. And obviously that's going to occur in a high moisture year. And it's viable for more than 39 years. And that's a weird number because most of these soil seed reserves experiments have been designed to be harvested at 5 or 10-year intervals. Well, this was part of what's called the Duval seed experiment. A seed burial experiment was done at one of the Virginia universities, started in 1902 and terminated in 1942 due to the World War II occurring and the military taking over that part of the university's property. So it knocks like days, they say 39 years, and that's the weirdness associated with that. Now back to why the Scotch thistle grows on these waterways or adjacent to the waterways is because it has a water-soluble germination inhibitor in the seed coat. And this keeps the plant from germinating precociously, if you will, and dying if there's no soil moisture. So all it needs is a little moisture and it can take off. And then it can occupy very dry habitat. I elk hunt in Northwest Colorado with Gary Brandon. Some of you guys may know him. And it's very distracted, if not distraught, this year at the expanse of Scotch thistle up there. They've had a few decent moisture springs, and so that's key. And since that time, it is scattered all over the northern parts of Moffat County where we hunt. It's just absolutely terrible, shocking. All right, so this is a photograph of the Scotch Thistle seedlings, and they're pretty distinct. They got a very visible midrib, and the leaves are even starting to twist a little bit, as you'll see in these older juveniles. This was taken, photograph was taken the year these plants came up. And so this is pretty typical. This is actually a good growth stage to be used in a herbicide. We tend to get it to the second year. So you can see last year's dead leaves, and then all that cottony pubescence is a distinct barrier to herbicide absorption. So that has to be dealt with either with a non-ionic surfactant or even a methylated seed oil. When it flowers, it's a pretty spectacular plant from its size. This specimen is about 7 feet tall. And notice what it's growing with, a bunch of cheatgrass and other junk. One of my nicknames for this is elephant ear thistle. Those leaves are about 2.5 feet long. They're just tremendous size plant. I spoke about Moffat County's Scotch thistle. It gets tall up there, but the flowers are small and the leaves are small because over the growing season it is just so dry. But all it needs is that spring moisture, and it's off to the races. Now, comparing the two different species of Scotch thistle, if you will, Anapoda on the left, you can see the pubescence grows right up to the flower heads, but the Tarian thistle on the right, you can see that it's devoid of that cottony pubescence except on the underneath side. And there's some small differences between the two flowers, and these are distinguished by the different ways and the different color that the bracts are. Now, an ed map of both, you can see Scotch thistle is a bigger problem throughout the western U.S., including here in Colorado. We have one spot down by Rye, and I remember the first time I saw it, I was going, well, that's the weirdest Scotch thistle I've ever seen. Well, I found out a few years later it wasn't Scotch thistle at all, it was Tarian thistle. Apparently a problem in some places in California. I listened to Joe DiTomaso talk about it at one of the Western Society of Weed Science meetings. Now, musk thistle is a common problem along the Front Range. We have quite a bit of it. It does exceptionally well on the Great Plains and clear into the eastern United States. It's another member of the sunflower family. We have a couple of species. Depending who you talk to, they think there's maybe one, could be two, Carduus nutans or Carduus macrocephalus. It wouldn't matter. They're noxious in Colorado. They're biennial plants reproducing only from seed. The soil seed reserve is about 10 years. They tend to emerge in spring or fall. Sometimes the fall emergers, particularly out on the plains, behave as annuals rather than biennials. Any plant that only sends its information and forward in time and space by seed, the key to its management is to prevent seed formation. That'll become important in just a minute. A photograph of two different, probably could be age. The one on the left could be a second year. The one on the right could be a first year rosette, although it looks a little bit like it's starting to bolt. So it could just be a size issue when it germinated that year. But a couple of distinctions here on on musk thistle. You can see the edges of the leaves look like they kind of have a frost on them. And then the very distinct yellowish, creamy yellowish midrib allows you to determine that this is indeed musk thistle. One way you can tell musk thistle from plumeless thistle, which typically is a bigger problem in the mountains, that musk thistle, at least on the terminal blooms, has almost no leaves on the stem, as you can see in this particular photograph. And that's an easy way to tell the two apart. Otherwise, they're quite different. They behave similarly in the form of in how you would manage them. My technician, Jim Sebastian, worked with me for 28, 29 years. He now is with Boulder Open Space. They're very fortunate to have him. Jim is an extraordinary worker. He took this photograph. If I'd have taken it, it'd all been blurry like the back, but we've got a lot of mileage out of it. But of outstanding representation of a typical musk thistle seed head, probably 2 to 3 inches in diameter and great big sharp bracts. Most of us at one time or another, in moments of stupidity, have tried to handle that without gloves on, and it's a very difficult chore. As far as control, similar herbicides, again, aminopyrrolid, whetstone for Scotch thistle is 5 to 7 fluid ounces per acre, and I definitely lean up to the higher end for Scotch thistle because it's much more difficult to control than musk. Musk Thistle's 3 to 5 fluid ounces. Triumph 22K is very reasonable at half a pint, 3/4 of a pint per acre. Again, rosettes are the target in spring or fall, but notice with whetstone, it's bolting. Got to let it bolt. Rosette to bolting in the spring of the year, or fall. So on the right hand, the upper right hand photograph, I tried to find some that were in that early bolting growth stage. That's a great timing for either whetstone or Triumph. And then, of course, on the right, the lower right is Musk Thistle in a rosette growth stage, and that's the best timing for probably most herbicides. Dicamba, we never could get it to work well on Scotch Thistle, so typically I restrict my recommendations to Musk Thistle with 2 pints per acre in the spring or fall. And this is where dicamba plus 2,4-D does shine very well. Just got to make sure it's in that rosette growth stage, or it can still set viable seeds. But 1 plus 2 pints per acre in the rosette stage, spring or fall, works very well on Musk Thistle. Now, one of the things I remember I used to smell, figuring it was dicamba plus 2,4-D or just dicamba, was spraying of Musk Thistle in this growth stage. And it's like, if that plant had a tongue, it would stick it out at you and giggle, because it's going to set viable seed. Yeah, you'll kill the plant, but there's seed that will be passed forward in time, and so it wins the battle, if you will. So this is a poor growth stage to use oxenic herbicides to control Musk Thistle. We did a study with DuPont a long time ago and published it, where we found that the sulfonylureas, like chlorsulfuron, which I think is the best choice, it eliminated viable seed formation if you had the application timing correct. And that was from bolting to very, very early bud growth stage, as I tried to show in these 2 photographs on the right. With the bolting muscles that were very robust plant or specimen, or down in the lower right, it's just starting to get flowers formed. We found that there would be no viable seed formed in that plant if chlorsulfuron was used at a half to 1 ounce, and I'd probably go at the 1 ounce rate. And you have to use a surfactant with that as well. Scotch Thistle's a different situation. It takes 2 to 3 ounces. The label says 1 to 3 ounces of chlorsulfuron 75. And the rosette, the very early bolt, and that's what I tried to show with that photograph on the bottom. Again, the surfactant is of key importance, especially with the Scotch Thistle. And sometimes we found, instead of using a surfactant on Scotch Thistle with chlorsulfuron, if we use methylated seed oil, it worked even better. The yellow toad flax is probably my most favorite plant we ever worked on. Mostly is because a lot of it was up in the flat tops area here in Colorado. It's a gorgeous wilderness, but just laced with this all over the place. Now, it is a handsome plant. It and Dalmatian toadflax were cultured as ornamentals for hundreds of years. And so they have some characteristics associated with that, not the least of which is convincing people to manage it. It has an interesting root bud phenology, just like Russian knapweed. And indeed, we think that's why our fall treatments work so well. And I'll flesh that out for you here as I go through. But it's native to the Eurasian area in Europe and Asia. It was introduced into North America in the 1600s, so it's been around a long time. It's naturalized across the country, but it's the biggest problem in the Intermountain West. Very, very problematic for us in Colorado and Wyoming, and it just loves Colorado. I mean, who doesn't? But we're the headwaters, and as it was introduced, we gave it an opportunity, and sure enough, it took every bit of it. I remember visiting with Hal Pierce, and he said he'd start spraying this stuff when the snow quit flying in the spring until it started flying again in the fall. So we think we discovered the optimum timing and application of a herbicide to control it, but Hal would just grin at me because it's only for a very short period of time, as you will see. So my student, Nick Crick, did this work, and as you can see, he took a very nice photograph showing the root bud growth on a section of yellow toadflax roots. He had 2 sites along the front range here, and on this graph, the thing to pay attention to is the solid black line. And each year at both locations, you can see there's an inflection point at flowering. The B is for bolting, F is for flowering, S is for senescence, and D is for dormant. These are periods, of course, of growth of the plants. And what he found is that each year at about flowering, there was this great inflection point between the lowest amount of adventitious buds that he counted to the highest, and it continued clear into the winter months. Again, probably a good reason why the fall applications work so well. And I'll flesh this out right now. Nick did an experiment at 5 different locations, a very robust experiment where we examined rates of chlorsulfion on imazapyr. And I'm just going to ignore the imazapyr because it just worked too well. I mean, it killed everything at sight. It's not a very selective herbicide. In fact, it's the basis for a number of our bare ground programs. So we examined chlorsulfuron at 0, 3/4, 1 1/4, and 1 3/4 ounces per acre. That becomes important here in a minute. The treatments were applied in September of 2008, and Nick collected data clear up through September 2010. And so this graph depicts the yellow toadflax density 2 years after we treated with one of those chlorsulfuron treatments. And as you can see at Camp Hale and at Hot Sulphur, that cluster of data, we had the greatest control. The green bar is what I'm looking at, and that's the 1 3/4 ounce rate. And it was somewhere between 90 and 95% control. It wasn't 100, but we were really close. And go, wow, what's going on there? And so we looked at Greenland. We didn't have the right situation. At the White River, we didn't have them. We actually had the correct situation with regard to plant biology at Wildcat Canyon, but it was a droughty year. And when drought occurs, all bets are off with yellow toadflax. You probably just simply aren't going to get control. So what Nick found at Camp Hale was that 83% of the plants had gone through the reproductive cycle. 65% at application were in the post-flower growth stage. That's senescence, the seed capsule growth stage. 18% of the shoots were still flowering. Flip over to the hot sulfur column of data. It was in the late bloom and senescence. About 76% of the plants had gone through a reproductive cycle. Saw the same thing at Wildcat Canyon. 75% of them had gone through or going through the reproductive cycle. So not quite as far along as Camp Hale or Hot Sulphur Springs, but adequate. But the drought, it's just simply nothing worked there. The other 2 sites, we didn't have that threshold met. Now, we did another experiment basically at the same time. They weren't coordinated per se, but you can see the photographs that Jim took of the growth stage of the plants. They were in the seed capsule growth stage at application, and they had a lot of adventitious root bud growth around the crown. 70% of the plants that he looked at had root buds on them. We looked at dicamba as Banville and overdrive, which is diflufenzapyr plus dicamba, Triumph 22K or picloram at both 32 and 64 fluid ounces per acre, and then Triumph 22K plus Banville at 32 plus 8, and then the combination with overdrive, and that's the one we were hoping that would work. We looked at that years before with yellow toadflax, and nothing became of that one. But it clearly is the case here that the diflufenzapyr in overdrive enhance the activity of the picloram. We have no activity really to speak of out of the Banville alone or the overdrive alone, and the Triumph 22K alone, even at 2 quarts per acre, didn't work as well as when we combined it at 1 quart per acre plus 8 ounces of overdrive. So that becomes one of our treatments of choice. So to summarize this, regardless of which of those 2 herbicides you're going to choose to use, 75% of the plants should be in the bloom or post-bloom growth stage at application. I'm trying to show that with this photograph down below. Or conversely, 25% of the shoots are still vegetative. The rate had to be high enough to overcome the spatial and temporal variation that we saw over the course of time. So chlorsulfuron at 1 3/4 of an ounce per acre works exceptionally well, but you have to mix in 1.5 pints of MSO. Now that's a too high rate where it's grazed. The maximum rate of chlorsulfuron is 1 1/3 ounces in a grazing situation, and you'll get decent control with that, but you're not going to get as much as 1 3/4, of course. So maybe in a graze situation, the Triumph 22K or picloram plus overdrive would be a better choice at 1 quart of the Triumph 22K and 8 ounces of overdrive. plus 1% or a pint and a half of per acre of MSO. Again, drought changes everything. We repeated this experiment at a location in Douglas County. Well, I was getting close to retirement, and when we went collect the last data set, it looked like things were working. But when I went back and put all the treatments together, nothing worked. It was just variation that occurred. And so it was very droughty at application. And I wondered about that. And sure enough, that changes everything. Now, Dalmatian toadflax is a little easier to control. We have two species, but the broadleaf Dalmatian toadflax is probably a bigger issue. It's a weekly creeping herbaceous perennial. Similar to yellow toadflax, probably not nearly as strongly clonal as you can see from photographs. They may produce upwards of 400,000 seeds per plant in a moist year. So you got to be careful with it. But the photograph on the bottom right is after a fire, a year after fire. And of course, it responded very positively to that disturbance. The Linearia dalmatica is displayed in this map, and we have quite a bit of it in Colorado. I don't think this is difficult to control as is yellow toadflax, so it tends to be less of an issue, but it's formidable to be sure. We watched a patch expansion at two sites. One of the sites had increased over 1,200% in density over a period of 6 years and caused a decrease in crested wheatgrass cover at the same time. If that isn't enough to stimulate you to do something about this, I don't know what would work. At the Boulder site, we only did it for 3 years, and we got a doubling of the stem density, but we also got an increase in grass cover at the same time. It's just different weather patterns. But again, it's increasing its influence on the environment rapidly. Dalmatian toadflax can be controlled very well with 1 quart per acre of picloram or triab 22K. Flowering has been one of the most consistent. Fall is also good, so it's not so picky about when it's most susceptible. Sulfuron works as well. 2 to 2.6 ounces per acre, so it can't be used in a gray situation. It'd be only a non-crop. And MSO 1.5 pints per acre is what worked well. And again, it's most consistent in the fall rather than at flowering. Panoramic can be used, but notice the use rate at 12 fluid ounces. Now we have one of our bare ground programs. We use Panoramic as a partner at 12 fluid ounces in the fall of the year. It's going to create bare ground. It's really hard on grasses at that rate. So you have to have a reason to use it, just to be perfectly honest. But it's fall after a hard frost. 25% of the top can be necrotic, but still got green tissue present. It's hard to use compared to the other two herbicides. I think Triumph 22K is probably the best choice. And one of my favorite plants of all time is Leafy Spurge. Euphorbia acetula, another creeping herbaceous perennial from hell, reproducing from seed and adventitious root buds, as you can see in the photograph in the bottom right, all those little pink buds. Now they're present all year round, so it's ready to rock and roll at a moment's notice. Very aggressive and very difficult to control. Might be the most difficult plant to control that we have encountered, and maybe even in North America. We have a salesman in Allegheny that also has a spraying business, and he first encountered this, and he wanted, how do I kill this stuff? And he defines stuff a little differently. But I told him, you don't. You just buy periods of time when you don't have it. And he really didn't believe me. He believes me now because he's been working on it a couple of years. It has very broad ecological amplitude from very wet to very dry habitats, from the urban setting to rangeland, very widespread across the northern tier of states. Our understanding is it's not a problem in the New England area, but everywhere else, it's a huge issue for us. Very, very difficult to control. I was first introduced to Leafy Spurge in northwestern Colorado. This is the 9 Mile Ranch outside of Meeker. And there it's even now competing Gamble Oak. This is the Badlands in North Dakota, adjacent to the Poudre River right here in Larimer County. I mean, it's a very formidable plant, and it's very much at home right next door to you in your neighborhood grocery store. It's very to say it's a tough plant is an understatement. Growing up through some freshly laid asphalt, growing out of a crack of a rock, and my personal favorite, growing out of a stump of a tree. Now, this is from Southwest Colorado. It's an amazing plant. Very difficult to control. The standard still is picloram. Our Triumph 22K is a good example of that. 1 quart per acre for 2 to 3 consecutive years, applied in spring at flowering, true flowering, as depicted in the upper right-hand corner of photograph. And or you can mix it with 2,4-D at 1 to 1.5 pints of Triumph 22K and 2 quart to 2,4-D. You will expand the susceptible species of plants with that, of course, but it's going to take another year. So that's always discouraging to people. And you'll usually get, after the 3rd year, somewhere between 80 and 90% control. And when control dips back down to about 70%, you got to start over again. So it's a tough critter. It is a tough critter. Panoramic works pretty well too, 8 to 12 fluid ounces in the fall. I'd avoid the 12 fluid ounces and stick closer to the 8, where you at least have some selectivity for the grass competition that will finish the weed control job. MSO should be used at 2 pints per acre. It is safe around most trees and near water where you could not use picloram. Paramount or Quinstar, which is quinclorac, it's got a lot of mileage, and some people see complete failure, and others see it works pretty well. I did this at my daughter and son-in-law's place north of Fort Collins, and it worked very well. It's a 16 ounces of product plus 1.5 pints of MSO per acre. It's very expensive, but it does work well. It's spring. That's supposed to be at the green bract formation, not yellow, such as depicted in the photograph on the right. So it's a little earlier than Triumph would be. It can also be applied in the fall, and it is very safe around trees. This has been used a lot down on the Palmer Divide, where the spurge is encroaching. Hoary Crest is a significant problem for us, has been for a long time. It's a creeping herbaceous mustard. We actually have 3 species of this. Lepidium draba or Hoary Crest is most prevalent, although you'll see there's some variation in that. We used to think that the orbicular white top, which we used to call lens-spotted Hoary Crest, may not even be in Colorado, but that's not the case. So hairy white top also is present. Now, the important thing is that the management is the same. The sulfonylureas and imidazolones, their claim to fame, as well as is for plant sensitivity, is the mustard family. They're herbaceous, creeping herbaceous perennial, reproducing from seed and from roots. The hairy white top and orbicular white top, they're present throughout the western U.S., but as you can see, Hoary Crest is the bigger problem, and it's spreading to the east. This is kind of an egg-shaped leaf. So this is Hoary Crest or Lepidium draba. It can have a blunt or even a somewhat pointed leaf tip. You can see some serrations on that. You know it's the mustard. It smells bad. But when it gets to be this size, and so it grows about 12 to 18 inches tall, and there's 2 ways you can tell it from Perennial Pepperweed, which is another mustard, is this one flowers very early. Hoary Crest is one of the first noxious weeds to flower in the spring of the year, often in March or April. Whereas Perennial Pepperweed is flowering in typically July. And the leaves of the Lepidium species that we call Hoary Crest clasp the stem, and you can see some examples in this photograph thereof, and which distinguishes it from Perennial Pepperweed because they don't clasp the stem. It's called white top because, of course, the flowers appear to be in a single plane. This is actually a good growth stage for using the sulfonylureas. It has monstrous root system problem, upwards of 30 feet deep, and the majority in the top 2 to 4 feet. But it can be a tremendous problem. The majority of the rhizomes within the first 24 inches, but this is why it recovers. It's just like the Canada thistle photograph I showed you. As far as control, again, the sulfonylureas and the imidazolones are outstanding, but you'll notice there is a difference in optimum timing of application. Metsulfuron, our product is MSM 60 at an ounce per acre, works exceptionally well. But it's to be at what Steve Dewey used to call the broccoli growth stage, very early flower before any of the petals come out, or is this photograph on the right, you see the buds just starting to open up. That's a good timing. Chlorsulfuron at an ounce is my preference because it'll provide soil residual that metsulfuron will not, and control germinating seedlings after you control the adults. The optimum timing is bud to early flower. Remember the broccoli growth stage example. Panoramic is also a really good choice. It's 8 to 12 fluid ounces per year, or excuse me, per acre, plus a couple of pints of MSO. The optimum timing is late flower to early post flower. So it's about 2 to 3 weeks later. We stumbled onto this when we were looking at some options for controlling perennial pepperweed in the San Luis Valley, and it became readily apparent that there is a huge difference in optimum timing between the two classes of herbicides that are very similar with regard to their site of action. Perennial pepperweed is the last weed I'll talk about today. It's another mustard species, Lepidium latifolium. It's another herbaceous creping perennial, reproducing from seed and from roots. It forms very dense monocultures, which I'll show you in just a little bit. It's going to be found in different areas than Hoary Crest. They overlap quite a bit, but it's typically in riparian zones or soils with very high water tables. So think of the San Luis Valley, where some parts of the year the water table is on the surface, and the perennial pepperweed just loves that. Hence why I have that photograph next to the creek. But you can see the substrate on the lower photograph where it's growing, the rocky soils and things of that nature. It grows well there. That's actually a photograph out of California. So they have a huge problem with it because the central part of California is in their delta areas is where they have the biggest problem with that. So, but along the South Platte River and Weld County is a great example of another location. Widespread throughout the western U.S. and of course, the western part of Colorado has a bigger problem than the eastern part, but it's distributed along the Front Range rather well. This is an experiment from ages ago. This is a 1 ounce rated chlorsulfuron somewhere in Weld County along the South Platte. But look how dense that monoculture is. It just shades out everything. Some people even think it's allelopathic, but that's never really been demonstrated. The cows don't mind. They were really curious what we were doing out there. But you can see how big and robust this plant is. And yet at the same time, it's not very palatable, but grazing might be helping to keep it out of that pasture on the left, or at a minimum, whoever owned that pasture is doing a better job of trying to manage it. But the dense nature of that stand on the right side of that fence line is pretty dramatic. Again, one way to tell this from Hoary Crest is that it does not clasp the stem like Hoary Crest does, that being the leaves, but it has a long petiole, and this will become apparent even as the plant bolts, even towards the top of the plant. The flowers are very similar, although they do not appear to occur in a single plane, but they're white petals in the shape of a cross, and hence the old name crucifery. As far as control, once again, the sulfonylureas or the imidazoles work exceptionally well. MSM 60 at 1 ounce per acre at the bud to flower and growth stage. Don't forget the surfactant at 0.25%. Chlorsulfuron 75. With the soil activity, you can get some germinating seedlings afterwards. However, it's at a time of year you're not getting a lot of seedling recruitment because it's going to be a June to July, first part of July application. But it's 1 ounce per acre at the bud to flower growth stage, and again with surfactant. Panoramic is also a good choice, 8 to 12 fluid ounces. I probably stick down towards the 8 fluid ounce range. Flowering into senescence, again, a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks later than you would than when you would use the sulfonylureas. And instead of a non-ionic surfactant, use an MSO with panoramic, as with all the imidazoline. So that's all I have. If you have any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them.
All right, Jonathan, we have some questions here. We have time for 2, so we'll take the 2 that are in the chat. This one from Christy. Our horse riding arena becomes consumed with Russian thistle. Is there a weedicide for Russian thistle that is safe to use around horses?
There would be a potential good use for product called Rejuvra in early in the year, you'd want to use combination with something like not overdrive, but overdrive would also work. Open site, or it's also sold as chaparral, available at Murdoch's. Rejuva is very pricey, and unfortunately, it's only available in 2.5 gallons. So, might be something that you'd want to have a contractor spray it, or use the chaparral and just go after the Russian thistle with mechanically after that.
Thank you. And a question from Karen. Can you address mullein control?
Mullein control is a challenge. You definitely want to have a methylated seed oil in the mix with your herbicide, because the hairiness of the leaves precludes the herbicide reaching the leaf surface. And again, chaparral works very well. Also, milestone, which Dr. Beck was referring to, the generic version, which is whetstone, works well in combination with Tellar, is even a better result.
Excuse me. Thank you, Jonathan. One more question real quick. What is the effect of the herbicides on predatory bugs?
At this point, we find very little information in regards to damage to the bugs. The herbicides are specific to the weeds. The challenge is if you get a complete kill of the weeds, then you might be destroying your biocontrol's food source. But they did accidentally find in North Dakota, fighting Leafy Spurge, that they could actually increase their spurge control by releasing the bugs in the spring, and then doing a late fall treatment on the spurge. So there are some advantages, but I try to focus on the fact that biological control should be where you can't get to with a herbicide, so that your herbicide treatments will actually force the biocontrols to those areas.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan.